head and really figure out what it is that's driving them. And knowing the Russians expected Secretary Clinton to win, would you see that some of those things that they've done would be consistent with undermining her presidency, not necessarily because they thought Mr. Trump was going to win and they wanted to help him?
Again, I think it's two closely related sides of the same coin. I mean, to put it in a homely metaphor, I hate the New England Patriots. And no matter who they play, I'd like them to lose. And so I'm at the same time rooting against the Patriots and hoping their opponent beats them, because there's only two teams on the field. But what the intelligence community concluded was, early on, the hatred for Mrs. Clinton was all the way along.
Yep.
When Mr. Trump became the nominee, there was some sense that it'd be great if he could win, it'd be great if we could help him, but we need to hurt her no matter what. And then it shifted to, he has no chance, so let's just focus on undermining her. That was the judgment of the intelligence community.
Well, I'd also, if I could highlight, I acknowledge the challenge at times about trying to understand intent. But the level of, we're not going to go into specifics in an open, unclassified form, but the level of sourcing, the multiple sources we had, which were able to independently corroborate the judgment. And there's a reason why we were high confidence in everything except just one issue, to include the intent.
I understand. I spent some time out at the CIA last week. I was with the staff as best we could through the 2,000 some odd pages. And by the way, not many people did. And some people are casting, aspersions in and not making the effort to go out there and actually look at that. But I'm telling you that having done that, I think a reasonable person could say what I've said here today, that there is another element to this, that there is another, as you said, Mr. Comey, another side of the coin. And this is a very, very difficult, in my opinion, thing to say with high levels of confidence, which is why, once again, the intelligence community isn't perfect sometimes. And we do make mistakes. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I'd like to come back for just a few minutes if we could after.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Schiff's recognized.
Thank you. Just a couple of quick follow-up questions by myself and Mr. Himes, and then we'll go to Mr. Castro. Director, you were asked about Director Clapper's comments, and I think your response indicated that they were correct as far as the unclassified intelligence assessment goes.
Yeah, that's what I understood the question to be about the report itself.
I want to make it clear to people, though, the intelligence assessment, the unclassified intelligence assessment, doesn't discuss the issue of U.S. person coordination with the Russians, and I assume that's because at the time of the report in January of this year, that was under an investigation that you have now disclosed. Is that right?
Correct. The counterintelligence investigation is the FBI's business. The IC report was about what the intelligence community had about what Russia had done. So there is nothing in the report about coordination or anything like that. It's a separate responsibility of the FBI to try and understand that, investigate it, and assess it.
So we shouldn't read Mr. Clapper's comments as suggesting that he takes a different view of whether you had sufficiently credible information and evidence to initiate a FBI counterintelligence investigation.
I don't know exactly what he meant. All I can say is what the fact is, which is we just laid out. There's the report, and then there's our investigation.
And the report doesn't cover the investigation?
Correct.
Mr. Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. Gentlemen, in my original questions to you, I asked you whether the intelligence community had undertaken any sort of study to determine whether Russian interference had had any influence on the electoral process, and I think you told me the answer was no.
Correct.
Correct. We said the U.S. intelligence community does not do analysis or reporting on the U.S. political process or U.S. public opinion. That is not our fault.
So thanks to the modern technology that's in front of me right here, I've got a tweet from the president an hour ago saying the NSA and FBI tell Congress that Russia did not influence the electoral process. So that's not quite accurate, that tweet.
I'm sorry, I haven't been following anybody on Twitter while I've been sitting here.
I can read it to you. It says the NSA and FBI tell Congress that Russia did not influence the electoral process. This tweet has gone out to millions of Americans, 16.1 million to be exact. Is the tweet, as I read it to you, the NSA and FBI tell Congress that Russia did not influence the electoral process, is that accurate?
Yeah. Well, it's hard for me to react to that. Let me just tell you what we understand the state of what we've said is. We've offered no opinion, have no view, have no information on potential impact because it's never something that we looked at.
Okay. So it's not too far of a logical leap to conclude that the assertion that you have told the Congress that there was no influence on the electoral process is not quite right.
Right. It certainly wasn't our intention to say that today, because we don't have any information on that subject. And that's not something that was looked at.
Right.
Admiral Rogers, before I yield back to the ranking member, there's another tweet that says, NSA Director Rogers tells Congress unmasking individuals endangers national security. My understanding was, as a member of the committee, that there is a lengthy and very specific process for the unmasking, but that it does not inherently in of itself endanger national security. I
assume the comment is designed to address the leaking of such information. But again, I have not read what you're saying to me, so I'm not in a position to comment on it, sir.
Thank you. I'll yield back to the ranking member.
Mr. Castro.
Thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, for your service to the nation and for your testimony today. I want to take a moment to turn to the Christopher Steele dossier, which was first mentioned in the media just before the election and published in full by media outlets in January. My focus today is to explore how many claims within Steele's dossier are looking more and more likely as though they are accurate. First, let me ask you, can you describe who Christopher Steele is?
No, not going to comment on that.
Are you investigating the claims made in the dossier?
Not going to comment on that, Mr. Castro.
Okay. Well, the reputation of the author, Christopher Steele, as a former accomplished British intelligence officer with a career built on following Russia is important. This is not someone who doesn't know how to run a source and not someone without contacts. The allegations it raises about President Trump's campaign aides' connections to Russians, when overlaid with known established facts and timelines from the 2016 campaign, are very revealing. So let's begin. In general, as my colleagues have discussed before, is it true that a large number of oligarchs and wealthy businessmen in Russia have profited from their continuing close relationships or cooperation with the Kremlin?
Could you say that one more time, sir?
Sure.
I want to make sure I understand.
Have oligarchs and wealthy folks in Russia profited from their connection to the Kremlin?
Yes.
And there are no free lunches in Russia. If you get wealthy under Putin, it's because you support Putin and are expected to support him. Is that fair to say?
I would assume there's a perception of advantage, but I would assume it also varies by the specifics of the particular individual and relationship we're talking about.
Okay. But Putin never just trusts, he verifies, right? As a former KGB man, he wants to keep tabs on his wealthiest citizens, especially those that could ever pose a challenge to him. Is that right?
Keep hitting this? You want to keep it?
I assume he maintains knowledge of the situation around him to include particular centers of influence within Russia.
Thank you. So is it likely that the Kremlin would accept or actively trade favors or other valuable or sensitive information, intelligence from foreign figures about Russian oligarchs or wealthy businessmen living abroad?
Is it possible? Yes, but again, it depends on the particulars of the situation. I don't know that I would make a flat statement on that.
But it's certainly a possibility.
It's a possibility?
Okay. Well, the dossier definitely seems right on these points. A quid pro quo relationship seems to exist between the Trump campaign and Putin's Russia. A July 19, 2016 entry, for example, asserts that Russians were receiving intel from Trump's team on Russian oligarchs and their families in the United States. An entry from June 20th, 2016 states, quote, Trump and his inner circle have accepted regular flow of intelligence from the Kremlin, including on his Democratic and other political rivals, unquote, which is something for something. A July 30th entry likewise states that, quote, a source close to the Trump campaign confirms regular exchange with the Kremlin has existed for at least 8 years, including intelligence fed back to Russia on oligarchs' activities in the United States. Is it generally true that Moscow actively seeks and supports, whether through the oligarchs, overt Russian officials, or undeclared intelligence officers, sympathetic or cooperative foreign figures abroad, whether through business dealings or political backing or a combination of the two?
I think it's generally true.
I mean, generally this is a tactic. Generally it's a tactic we have seen over time, but again, I would caution us, we're talking about very specific cases theoretically here, and I'm not prepared to get in any of the specifics.
And I know that my colleagues have touched upon this, but I think it's important in the context of Christopher Steele's dossier to bring it up again. So my question is it likely or plausible that the Russians might seek out Americans for Moscow's purposes?
It is one of the focuses of our counterintelligence mission to try to understand the ways in which they try to do that. That's at the core of their intelligence gathering, is try and co-opt, recruit Americans to give them information.
So the dossier states in an entry dated August 10, 2016, that a, quote, Kremlin official involved in U.S. relations, unquote, suggests that Moscow might offer assistance to, quote, sympathetic U.S. actors. Does this sound like a plausible tactic out of the Russian playbook?
I'm not going to comment on that, Mr. Castro.
Okay. Now, let's get even more specific. Among the U.S. actors, this Kremlin official mentions are Carter Page and Michael Flynn, whom my colleagues have already discussed at length and which the dossier describes as, quote, examples of successes by the Kremlin official. We know Carter Page went to Moscow on July 7th to give a speech to the new economic school. We're in possession of the slide deck from his speech there. And we know Carter Page obtained approval from the Trump campaign manager at the time, Corey Lewandowski, as reported in Politico, citing National Security Campaign official J.D. Gordon. Now, let me ask you another question with respect to somebody else. Is it correct that Igor Senchin, the president of Russian oil giant Rosneft, is a former member of Russian intelligence and a longtime aide and confidant to Vladimir Putin?
Not going to answer that, Mr. Castro.
In an October 18, 2016 entry, the dossier states that during Page's visit to Moscow, he met with Igor Senchin, offering, quote, Page and Trump's associate the brokerage of up to 19% stake in Rosneft, with Page confirming that, quote, if Trump were elected U.S. president, sanctions on Russia would be lifted. And although, fortunately, the White House hasn't been so naive as to unilaterally lift sanctions on Russia, it was widely reported that on January 27th of this year, Rosneft sold a 19.5% stake in Rosneft in what Reuters calls, quote, one of its biggest privatizations since the 1990s. Furthermore, Reuters reported that, quote, public records show the ownership structure of the stake ultimately includes a Cayman Islands company whose beneficial owners cannot be traced. What a coincidence. Is this the subject of your investigation? One of the subjects of your investigation?
Same answer.
Okay.
Meaning I'm not going to comment.
I understand. So let's move to WikiLeaks for a moment, who played such a prominent role in the 2016 election. As has been established before and reestablished at this hearing, WikiLeaks was at a minimum an unwitting pawn and at maximum an active co-conspirator of the Kremlin's in publishing stolen DNC and senior Democratic officials' emails. And do you agree this was done in order to offer Moscow some measure of separation as to mask its hand in having hacked and stolen the data in the first place, but so it could still have it publicly posted to inflict damage on the Clinton campaign?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yes.
Okay. An entry from July 19, 2016 in the dossier states that a Trump associate knew that the Kremlin was using WikiLeaks in order to maintain, quote, plausible deniability of its involvement. 3 days after this entry, WikiLeaks carries out the Kremlin's wishes and publishes upwards of 20,000 stolen DNC emails and 8,000 associated email attachments. And the rest, as they say, is history. Another entry, dated August 17th, has Carter Page and a Russian associate discussing WikiLeaks, publishing emails in order to swing Sanders supporters away from Clinton and to Trump. And again, from a September 14th entry of the dossier, quote, Kremlin has further compromising material on Clinton in form of emails and considers disseminating after parliamentary elections in late September. And on October 7th, WikiLeaks publishes John Podesta's hacked emails. So the coincidences keep piling up. Let's turn, in the few minutes that I have remaining, again to Paul Manafort as a follow-up to Mr. Himes' questioning. Suffice it to say, Paul Manafort was a major part of the Trump campaign, including serving as its chairman, convention manager, and chief strategist before departing the campaign in disgrace in August 2016. It's also established the fact that Paul Manafort was a longtime official advisor to pro-Russian Ukrainian political leadership. Is Paul Manafort a subject in your investigation?
I'm not going to comment on that.
All right. Director, can you describe to the American people the Russian concept of kompromat?
It's a technique that they use to gather information on people that may be embarrassing or humiliating and using it to coerce cooperation.
In your career, have you known instances where that has been successfully leveraged?
Yes, I believe our counterintelligence division has encountered it a number of times.
Does that include private places, including places such as hotels that are wired for audio and video?
I don't think I remember enough about the particulars to say, but in theory, sure.
Thank you. I yield back. I yield back to ranking member Schiff.
I recognize Mr. Heck.
Admiral Rogers, before I get into my main body of my remarks, I want to go back to your earlier comment about that there is no evidence to indicate that there was a successful Russian hacking of voter results or tabulations. What I did not hear you say is whether or not there had been any attempts to hack into election systems of any kind.
I can answer that because the FBI's responsibility is in the United States. We saw no indication of that. We saw efforts to penetrate voter registration databases, state boards of elections at that level. We saw no efforts aimed at the vote itself.
But you did see efforts to penetrate registration rolls?
Correct.
Did you see efforts to penetrate any other portions of election systems other than registrations? In this country, it's a highly decentralized system. And as a consequence, as you will recall, then Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson indicated that election systems should become a part of our critical infrastructure for cybersecurity purposes.
Their efforts were aimed at the voter registration systems in various states, and it takes different forms in various states. Sometimes there's a private vendor, sometimes it's state, but that's where it was focused and not on the vote itself, vote machines, vote tabulation, vote transmission that we've seen.
Thank you. I yield back to the ranking member, I think.
Time's expired, and let me go quickly to Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's been a lot of statements that have been made up here as opposed to questions, and we don't certainly feel the need to clarify all of them, but there is one aspect that does need to be clarified because it's also involved both of your testimonies. There has been discussion up here concerning the statements by James Clapper, and rather than do the conjecture as it has been made, I'm going to just read it. Chuck Todd said, "Let me ask you this. Does intelligence exist that can definitively answer the following question, whether there were improper contacts between the Trump campaign and Russian officials?" James Clapper said, "We do not include any evidence in our report." I say our, that's NSA, FBI, and CIA, with my office and the Director of National Intelligence, that had any reflection of collusion between members of the Trump campaign and the Russians. There was no evidence of that included in our report. Chuck Todd followed up. I understand that, but does it exist? James Clapper answered, not to my knowledge. So the text is not merely related to the report. I yield back.
Mr. Crawford's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. I'll start with Director Comey. Despite your expressed disdain for the New England Patriots, I think that Tom Brady would probably like to express his gratitude for the FBI's assistance in recovering his stolen Super Bowl jersey, so I'll do that on his behalf now.
Thank you. By the way, if I'm honest with myself, the reason I don't like the Patriots is they represent sustained excellence. And as a Giants fan, that drives me crazy.
Director Comey, are you familiar with an article, July 18th, 2016, from the Washington Post entitled "Trump Campaign Guts GOP's Anti-Russia Stance on Ukraine"?
I'm not familiar with that article. I don't remember it.
Ask unanimous consent to add this to the record. Just for your edification, Director, there's an allegation contained in that article that as a National Security Committee platform meeting, Trump staffers wrote an amendment to an amendment that stripped out platforms call for providing, quote, lethal defensive weapons and replace it with softer language calling for, quote, appropriate assistance. Are you familiar with a March 18th, 2017 story in the Washington Examiner entitled How Pundits Got Key Parts of the Trump-Russia Story All Wrong? Are you familiar with that?
I don't think I am.
I'd ask unanimous consent to add that to the record, and also for your edification, I'll go to some of the meat of that story. Are you aware of an allegation that Trump staffers gutted the Ukraine plank of the platform?
Am I aware of the article on that?
Are you aware of anything to that nature, the article, or any activity to that end?
I don't want to talk about anything. I'm willing to comment on whether I've seen different things in the media. I don't want to talk about anything beyond that.
Okay. So then, safe to say you're not aware of the final platform that retained all of the language from the original platform plus a portion of the amendment offered by the platform committee member?
I don't want to comment.
Okay. Then I'll go through. I know that you're limited on what you can comment on. I'll go through some of the as I said, the meat of this. Reading from the platform, it says, quote, "We will meet the return of Russian belligerents with the same resolve that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. We will not accept any territorial change in Eastern Europe imposed by force in Ukraine or elsewhere, and will use all appropriate measures to bring to justice the practitioners of aggression and assassination," end quote. Does that sound to you as like a pro-Russian or a pro-Putin statement in your assessment?
That's not for me to comment on.
Okay. Further, in the platform it says, quote, "We support maintaining and, if warranted, increasing sanctions together with our allies against Russia unless and until Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity are fully restored. We also support providing appropriate assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine and greater coordination with NATO defense planning." And again, that sounds like fairly clear language in their relationship to Russia. Would you agree?
Same answer, Mr. Crawford.
Okay, thank you. The final language I'll get to here in just a sec. There was an amendment, but the final language regarding that plank of the platform with regard to national security relating to Russia. It says, quote, "We support maintaining and, if warranted, increasing sanctions together with our allies against Russia unless and until Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity are fully restored. We also support providing appropriate assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine and greater coordination with NATO defense planning." And again, to me, that sounds fairly clear and straightforward that is not conducive to a Putin administration. Would you agree?
Give you the same answer, Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, sir. It's also important to note that that platform was adopted in coordination with and in concert with the Trump administration as they met at the convention and they went through the platform process. The Trump campaign agreed to the platform condemning Kremlin belligerents, calling for continued and perhaps increased sanctions against Russia, as I indicated in the text of that platform, for the full restoration of Ukrainian territory, for refusing to accept, quote, "any territorial change in Eastern Europe imposed by force in Ukraine or elsewhere," and pledging to aid Ukraine's armed forces. So I bring that up just to highlight and note the fact that none of that appears to be pro-Putin or pro-Russia language.
Mr. Crawford, will you yield back to me? So Mr. Comey, I just want